Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Victoria. Welcome to the third annual Community Energy Forum. It's amazing. First time hosting in the West Coast. We've done coast to coast because we had it in Halifax last year. So we're taking over Canada. For those who don't know, my name is Martin Boucher. I'm the chair and president of the CECC, and proud to be representing the CECC and kicking off our event for the Energy Forum. And this would not have been possible without a lot of other folks that have supported this Energy Forum. Our board, we have Carl, Rod, Danny, Darcy, Jeff, Rocky, and Dennis, who all contributed to this Energy Forum. And we also have our wonderful staff support, Josie and Jody. These are two different people. I keep on saying that, and then I keep on messing up so we'll try not to mess them up. Josie has done a lot of the logistics, planning, speakers, all this stuff. If you find yourself fed and this sort of thing, that's because of Josie. So I'll get Josie to wave her hand. And we also have Jody helped out with the AGM. She's our recent manager hire, and she's helping out with things. So thank you very much. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Esquimalt and Sojinese nations. We honor their deep knowledge, stewardship, and ongoing presence. Royal Roads is located on the site of the Esquimalt Lagoon, a place of profound cultural and ecological importance. We recognize and respect the significance of this land and families and ancestors of these people. The Community Energy Cooperative Canada is a national network grounded in local communities and working in partnership from coast to coast. As we meet here on these lands, we also acknowledge the many Indigenous nations and territories our members live and work within. So to introduce our speaker today, I'm pleased to turn it over to Dr. Julie MacArthur, who's a friend and colleague of mine, and also someone that deserves a lot of credit for making this Energy Forum happen, for supporting us with Royal Roads, helping us with this location, helping us with speakers. The list goes on and on and on. So thank you very much, Julie, and I'll turn it to you to introduce our keynote.
Thank you, everybody. And I'd also like to add another thank you to Ara, who's not here. She's a research assistant of mine, and she also has been running around. You know, these things have so much behind the scenes, right? And so you actually can't give enough thank yous. A lot of that is feminized work, which matters quite a bit. And so these thank yous are so important. I'm glad we're taking the time to do them. So I'd like to also welcome you folks to the lands of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. So I hope many of you, I keep hearing over and over again, and this is not new, this feeling of gratitude to be here. The place is really quite special. Dan, who's been working with me, he did a degree here and didn't even get to visit the place. This is his first visit to the place. So these kinds of events are building connection and community on places that just sing, really. We were talking about maybe forest bathing as an activity that happens here, but Royal Roads is a special place. The land is special. The history behind the land is special. Right down there by the water is where we host every year the National Indigenous Peoples Day gathering, right? With the canoes and the teepee, and the school children come and really celebrate the history and ancestry and the fact that the peoples have been living and working with the land, on the land, for thousands of years. And recently, just this week, there's a traditional canoe trip that takes place that starts up the coast in BC and goes all the way down into Washington State. And they stop here in Victoria yesterday, I think. And there's this really wonderful sense of place. I think that's what we're doing with the CECC as well. Community Energy Cooperatives Canada is about building these connections and networks and this kind of geographically rooted power, which I think is really interesting. Now, I know my job here is not to talk about CECC or myself or Royal Roads, but my heart is so full right now, reconnecting with many of you folks in the room. I'm so humbled and so happy that you made the trek to be here, to learn about the place, to learn about co-ops, but also because Anna's here. Now, I might get a bit choked up. The last time we saw each other, we both did. I met Anna almost, I want to say almost 10 years ago, but maybe 8. I was working as an academic at the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I got an email from this woman who was like, I heard you do work on energy democracy in communities. I want to do this work. We met and we ended up working with each other on this wide range of projects. And one of the things that I absolutely adore about Anna and why we are so privileged to have her here is because she has written not only as an academic, like Anna, she's a lead researcher at the Community Power Agency in Australia. She's also an academic at Griffiths University and an academic lecturer, senior lecturer now, I think, at Massey University in New Zealand. So she brings this wealth of international perspective, but a lot of the publications that many other researchers and I in the room cite of Anna's, one of them you did with Emily Creamer was about how there's a lot of enthusiasm about community energy, but not enough real, like, on the ground research about what the impacts actually are. And her work over the last decade and a half or more has been studying and contributing to actual work with policy agencies, with community energy actors. She is not an ivory tower academic, even though she's brilliant and does that too. She straddles writing policy reports for all sorts of different actors, working with community power agencies, doing so in an amazing way. And she's traveled around the world doing this. So if you look at her huge list of kind of reports and publications and communications, she's written pieces on the history of community energy in the UK, on how to develop like local power innovation in New Zealand, Australia, like so many different places. So I hope you will share with me in giving her a huge welcome. She flew all the way from Australia to talk to us tonight and to give me a big hug, which is wonderful. But I'm so honored to welcome Dr. Anna Berka all the way from Australia.
Thank you, Julie. Sorry, I was going to walk around a bit, but I think I might start off here. No, it's all right. I've got one, but this is working. Julie, thank you very much. I am also extremely grateful to be here. You know, so yeah, actually, and I'll just mention this briefly before I kick off. But you know, I was all alone working on this in New Zealand when I met Julie, and if I hadn't had met you, I don't know what would have happened to me, essentially, you know. So but yeah, just very grateful to reconnect, and also for the opportunity to learn from all of you about what you're doing in the next couple of days. I'm really excited about that. Today, I've got my Community Power Agency hat on because since, it's about a year ago that I became a practitioner again. So Community Power Agency is, we work online, remotely throughout Australia. And until last week, we were all women, and we've hired our first dude under our new diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm just going to talk a little bit today about what we do, and then in context, right, of the broader context in Australia around what shapes the social challenges in the energy sector and that motivate the work that we do, you know? And then what I thought I might do is just give you like a stock take of the different forms of participation, community participation that we're seeing in Australia, and then go into some specifics, if we have some time, on a specific project out in Queensland, which is probably one of the most hostile places for community participation that I've seen to date, and yet bears very many similarities with places like New Zealand and, I think, like BC, for example, right? So I really think there are very interesting similarities between the Australian and Canadian context that's going to excite a lot of people here that we can talk about. And then what I thought we might do is flip the discussion around to you and talk about what those commonalities might be. And also really, what are the underlying factors that actually shape these opportunities, right? That we can leverage, right? And drive. So what can we learn from each other, essentially? So before we get going, if you follow CPA on LinkedIn, some of you, Martin, you might do, you might know Jara Hicks. She's the one who founded the organization back in 2011. And initially the work was very much geared to supporting community energy projects and actually just legitimizing it as a concept, right, in the Australian context. But what's so interesting is that since 2011, the work that CPA now does is much broader in scope. And they work with government, state, federal government, regional government, city councils. They also work with developers, you know, now. And I'll just explain a little bit why that is. We are a co-op. I just wanted to say that here today. You know, we think a lot about what our shared values are, and we hold each other accountable to those. And we are quite small, but we really try to be as flat as possible, acknowledging also that that's not always possible, right? In every aspect of what we do. And we follow that through. So for example, we do pay parity as well. Yeah. So this is sort of the full range of work that we sort of span across. So starting from community energy there on the left, but also how do we support best practice community engagement in renewable energy? How do we better support industry and government to make sure that the benefits of larger scale renewables, of utility scale renewables, are shared with local communities? How can we support the delivery of more innovative co-ownership and co-investment models in the energy sector, right? And this again, it applies to larger scale projects. So, and further still, all the way to the right there, we're now starting to think about how we can better manage the broader social impacts and environmental outcomes of renewable energy. And here I'm talking about things like local procurement, local opportunities for workforce. So ways in which we can get developers teamed up with local government to think about how can we coordinate with ourselves to make sure that some of the employment that's happening here goes to the local community, right? Which is actually really difficult to do. So lots of challenges there to meet. So I'm not going to go on and on, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that we've done just to give that sort of arms and legs so you get a better sense of what we do. So a lot of guides, right? So one of the first guides that CPA wrote was a how-to guide for community energy. One of my colleagues, Kim, has developed the first community solar garden last year. And we're now seeing that model has become like a viable blueprint, right? It's set precedent for other people to take up this model and try to build one themselves. So we're now working with the city council and with a mutual insurance company, which really, you know, so kind of unlikely actors are coming forward saying, this might work for us, right? Could you help us work through what that might look like for us? And this is a really cool report that Eleanor Buckley did in 2023. It was a stock take of the sector, but also really trying to assess what the impacts were of the sector. When it comes to benefit sharing and shared ownership, the work we do is really, in large part, it's synthesizing the evidence base of what good practice looks like, essentially, right? So this is a guide we wrote in 2019, written by Jara and Taryn Lane, and it details all the different solutions for benefit sharing. So ranging from neighborhood benefit funds, but all the way to some of the more innovative models that we're seeing, such as multi-stakeholder PPAs, for example, or you have a project and they offset part of the generation for a local industry or a neighbor, right, for their use, essentially. Now, this is something that came out recently, and this is about, this whole guide is about when you have a concentration of large-scale renewable energy projects, and they're all going to the same motions of community engagement, community benefit funds. Is it not better to actually coordinate between each other and think about, at a regional scale, what could we do together to create legacy impacts from these fundings and maximize social impact, essentially. And it goes through sort of the governance options for how you might go about that. Yeah. And then in this space, the other thing we do is Australia has I'm sure Canada has similar market-based instruments. It's a competitive auction mechanisms, right, for generation and storage at both federal and state level. Not all states, but some states. And what we've managed to do is write social merit criteria into the assessment for these mechanisms, so that developers are now assessed not just on the basis of technical, right, and economic criteria, but also to what extent are they planning and how to deliver these community benefits. And a lot of other sort of policy advice type of work as well. And then recently, we've been teaming up with a couple of developers to essentially provide really bespoke advice as to how might you go about community engagement strategies, right? Or how could you deliver a specific community co-investment model? And what we're finding, this will come as no surprise to you, I think, at all, but is that a lot of developers don't know the full range. Well, they don't have the in-house expertise, right, capability. They're not aware of the full range of benefit sharing options. They wouldn't know where to start, but even in terms of community engagement, they don't know how to facilitate it in a way that meets the community where they are at on their terms, right, in their language. So what we've done is develop a professional short course, especially for them, that they can go and take, fully online and flexible. Yeah, in the hope that, you know, practices improve, essentially. And finally, recently, one of my colleagues, Heidi, who's based out in the New England, which is part of New South Wales. And she's sort of different from us in that she's permanently based there and engaging with stakeholders, trying to make things happen, essentially, right? Where the rest of us are doing a lot of sort of national work. And she wrote this guide together with some others on how to build better biodiversity on solar farms. So that's sort of us. I think that's a good picture. Any questions for now? Shall I move on? I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. So if I see you slouching, I will make you jump up and down or something.
What's been the uptake of the course?
We just opened it 2 months ago. It's not like, not at all. It's been a bit slow. Yeah, it's not free, no. And part of the reason it's not free, it's because it's accredited, and we wanted that, right? And it's provided in partnership with the university, and of course, so there are ongoing costs also in terms of marketing and stuff like that.
That's one of the things we're going to be doing 2 years, is developing a micro-credential. So that's sort of what I was thinking about, like what the uptake has been, how impactful that it's just sort of kicking off right now.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do as well is to build a network of people around it, like a community of practice around it, so that we meet, you know, every 2 months. And I mean, these are all practitioners. They all have invaluable knowledge to bring to the table, right? So we meet online and we just hear what problems are people running up against, right? And to sort of run that alongside there. So, but yeah, I think I'll keep you posted. tell you how it goes. Might be one of those sunk investments that you never see. Yeah. All right. So, I'll move on to, I've just got 3 slides on social challenges, just to give you a bit of background context as to like what motivates us to, you know, to across that breadth of work. And I'm excited about this because I want to hear if it's the same over here. And I suspect much of this is. So this is Australia, obviously, right? This is from an absolutely amazing paper that came out from Nature Energy a while back. And what it essentially shows is the governance, different governance arrangements that exist in different parts of the country. And so under the diagonal blue line, everything sits under the national electricity market, and is tightly regulated in terms of guaranteed levels of service provision. Beyond that, which is, as you can see, a huge part of the interior and the north, you largely have isolated grid networks, right? And in the far north there, the green patch of Queensland, for example, and in the Northern Territory, that consists of essentially state-provided, diesel-based, I kid you not, isolated networks, a lot of energy poverty, right, of First Nations, and people paying for electricity using prepaid electricity metering. It's the backside of Australia that nobody seems to talk about, or not enough, right? And that's out there. And then Western Australia has its own thing. It's a bit weird, so we like to. So, all the red threads there are transmission lines, right? And that's where everybody lives. And then, well, that's where most of the populated areas are. So beyond that, you've got these kind of really thinly populated communities. And supplying power to these thinly populated communities has always been an issue, right? It's always been essentially economically completely unviable. And it's shaped electricity governance in a really big way. So within, electricity governance is mostly a state affair, right? It's a multi-level affair, but a lot of it sits at that state level. And so what we see is that within states and regions, the energy sector composition looks very different. The openings for energy decentralization are very varied across these areas, and the policy settings as well. This paper, this What It All paper, one of the reasons I really like this paper is because it just took existing data, right, that existed and showed that if you overlay Indigenous and remote communities with these indicators, you can see that Indigenous and remote communities are significantly underserved, right? In terms of the service level that they get, but also opportunities for grid connection as well. And of course, the white elephant in the room, it's no surprise to you at all, is that this existing system, if you trace it all the way back, right, you can see where the settler colonies started and where the subsequent development started. It just reinforces those colonial legacies of marginalization. So that's sort of the age-old problem. Now, let's turn to Australia's energy transition planning, right? So one of the most influential concepts that has been implemented and put forward is this notion of renewable energy zones, which they imported from the US, right? It was first implemented in Texas, I think, and Australia started implementing these in 2017. So that's all the red spots there. So it's essentially a concept where if you concentrate, if you master plan out the infrastructural development that you'll need to meet your targets, and you make sure that it's matched to areas with high resource potential, then you can coordinate and plan the investment in an orderly and cost-efficient way, right? That's the idea. But of course, what it does is means that in these areas, you've got communities facing 10s, 20, 20 like large projects all over them, all around. So it's obviously led to huge social license issues. And in some cases, you've got areas, right, because it's sort of on the fringe there, as you can see, if you stand up north, that these communities also have poor energy services and lack the means to invest and participate. So these renewable energy zones have become both entry points, but also sort of battlegrounds and testing grounds for building policy capacity in general, right, in energy, but also for social innovation and for more inclusive approaches and for benefit sharing. And that's sort of the ecosystem that CPA is sitting in. And it's also benefiting from, because without these renewable energy zones, I don't think we'd be doing that range of work that we are today, essentially, right? So there's a whole kind of like ecosystem emerging around these renewable energy zones. So I mentioned social license. We hate that word. And it's, I honestly think that it'll be one of those words that will fade out of existence, as many words do, right? They get hyped up and then they disappear, right? As they get exploited by corporates generally. So we don't like it because it suggests that you can buy something, that it's a one-off transaction, which is just not how it works, right? So what we see is that within these renewable energy zones, we've got reactive policy provisions for managing local impacts and benefit sharing. It has in many cases led to really inappropriate renewable energy developments. So some good examples are in Queensland, tropical primary forest. I mean, obviously just not good sites for development. And just the social nature of organized opposition is also very interesting, right? It's a complex mix of local actors, but often supported by national advocacy campaigns. There's this sort of interplay between local impact and exclusion from decision-making, and perceived fairness, but also misinformation and distrust, right? Distrust of not just of utilities, but of the legitimacy of the environmental impact assessments, processes that are in place, distrust of the system, right? And so some really powerful leaders have come forward, and they like to play that line that, it's a threat to farming and to rural economies. And what I think is so interesting about this is, my colleague did some research on this for her master's thesis, is she found that these networks of organized opposition were in part driven by finding a shared identity and purpose, right, with other people. They're looking for community, right? Yeah, and all of this against this sort of agricultural communities, very large landowners who have opportunities for hosting these projects and others who don't, right? So it creates a lot of conflict. And they love these kind of photos. They're all over the websites. Some of you know that, so Julie mentioned I'm an academic, so I have to bring theory into this. So the work ahead in my mind is, for us, right, is we have to demonstrate the impacts and the outcomes of inclusive and exclusive approaches, right? And show how they're different in a really concrete way, in a way that people can understand it. We want to drive experiments in the innovation sense that can deliver benefits. And we see time and again how powerful that can be, right? In terms of the broader social value that these first projects can have. A really important task for us is aggregating kind of how knowledge, right, in a general kind of synthesis way, and then taking that and renegotiating and re-anchoring those solutions in other contexts. And of course, there's a hell of a lot of advocacy work that needs to be done as well to institutionalize enabling policies and regulations as well. Yeah. So what I thought I'd do next, if that's all right with you, is just, I'll try to speed it up a little bit because I can see some people are looking a bit tired. So, and give you an overview of what community participation looks like. And I'm using this term here, if you'll just let me, I'm using shared ownership to encompass not just community-led energy projects, but also developer-led projects that enable the legal and financial participation of community organizations. So it's sort of an umbrella concept, a big bucket of participation, if you like, that I'm using. Yeah. So these projects, are diverse, as we know, right? We're talking about any kind of initiative here. We don't have any co-investment in transmission, but you guys do, right? We have some First Nation equity ownership in transmission projects, so we've been looking at those. So they can be community-led, or they can be developer-led, or in very rare instances, it might be two parties genuinely from the outset co-designing a project. And in my mind, all of these are avenues to creating local benefits and long-term social value and local support. So when it comes to community energy, this is what it looks like in Australia. We think there's about 750 projects. In 2003, they raised about $87 million, but most of them sit in these progressive states. Yeah. And that's because, not just is there sort of more animo for it, there's richer communities that have more capacity to think about the state of the world and all of that stuff, right? But there's better policy support as well. So if we look back in 2006, there was nothing. It was just bulk buys. Bulk buys were really instrumental in Australia to help communities familiarize themselves with solar technology in particular. And then in the next, 15 years or so, we've seen a lot of growth in energy efficiency, microgeneration, so for community facility projects. One really big model that's taken off is you have private investment, right? They call it community investment, but it's really just, mom and dad investors investing into behind the meter commercial solar battery projects, so like 100 kilowatts or something, right? So that's really scaled in the sense of hundreds of projects. And then what we have is a handful of mid-scale projects, because mid-scale projects are really, really hard in the Australian context. Yeah. So I would say we're far behind Canada in Indigenous and renewable energy. But there is obviously increased interest, especially in large-scale projects and also partnerships. And microgrids, as you say, because a lot of these are edge-of-grid communities. Yeah. So I thought you might be interested in the co-op situation in Australia. It's not, I would say, that a dominant vehicle by any stretch of means, but it's an important one, and obviously used for all the reasons that right? It's to aggregate households as participants in a project. It's for democratic governance reasons. It allows benefit sharing, whether that be through shares or bill credits, for example. And one thing that's very interesting that I've not seen anywhere else in the world is we have a First Nations cooperative as well. Which for example, doesn't exist in the New Zealand context, right? And I think, we can talk about that, but it's interesting to think about why that may be. So I don't know if some of you may be familiar with Hepburn Energy. It's really well known. It's a really well-known project, mid-scale project, wind project in New South Wales. This project was pioneered by someone who I really regard as Australia's leading climate and energy champion. I've seen her work commercial developers in a way that I've never seen anyone else do. So I have a lot of admiration for Tyron Lane. Yeah. So this project is a 2-turbine project on the distribution network. The scale and revenue model was very much shaped by network capacity constraints. It's interesting for a number of reasons. What Hepburn Co-op has done is not just is there cooperative ownership of the actual assets, right, and the returns that come with that, but there's a special residential retail offer as well, which goes to the broader community, right? So in Australia, you don't, like elsewhere, you wouldn't see mid or small to mid-scale generators like this operate on the wholesale market by themselves. They have to work via an off-take agreement or a PPA agreement with a retailer, right? And it's very difficult to find a retailer willing to make work of small scale projects, essentially, who, you know, find it sufficiently interesting to, because it's very risky. As a small scale project, you're very vulnerable to things like curtailment and negative wholesale prices and things like that. So she's found a retailer, Flow Power, that manages the market settlement for her, or for them, I should say, for the co-op. And then they package up a retail offer that is then offered to local residents to say, you know, this is how you can buy electricity from your local wind farm, essentially. And it comes with an offset product as well. So just a couple of weeks ago, Gale and Gusto, the turbines, that's the name of the turbines, they had a baby battery. Yeah. I know, I thought you'd laugh at that. Which in this setting is pretty useful, right? Because it means that it was so risky, and for her to firm the revenue stream up, she can now start playing the wholesale market and substantially increase the income from those two turbines. If we look at the broader impacts of a project like this, it is so amazing, right? It's not just the direct member financial benefits. It's the pooled revenues that and the projects that you can deliver with that funding on the ground as well. You have a question?
Sure. Oh, do we have to?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the recording. Yeah, for our future selves. Yeah, this is really interesting. You said 4 cooperatively owned public EV chargers. Could you say more about what that is exactly?
So they installed EV chargers, free of use, just in the local community.
Why is there 4, not 1?
Because it's for the whole community in different places, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm moving on to partnership projects. So a little bit of a different beast. I would say we have maybe 1 or 2 established models, but then there's a whole bunch of other projects that are sort of under development. So the first one I'll tell you about, and this information comes from the First Nations Clean Energy Network. They have a map that show all of these projects. I'd highly recommend you have a look at their website if you're interested in this area. So out of the 21 that are on the table, none of them are operational yet. 9 of them involve equity stakes. But my impression is most of them are sort of memorandums of understanding. And by the time, a lot can happen between a memorandum of understanding and actually delivering like equity stakes on the ground, right? And those equity stakes, from what I can see, are in exchange for land, in exchange for cultural heritage, environmental services, but also things like, you know, arrangements where the First Nation is expected to essentially cough up the capital at the time of financial close as well. So beyond that, we've got only 2 successful partnership projects at the moment, right? Canoa Bridge Wind Farm and Sapphire Wind Farm. Now, one of the reasons I'm so impressed with Taryn Lane is because Taryn Lane was also the mastermind behind this Sapphire project. So she's got her hands in all sorts of really cool projects in Australia. So there's a bit of information there about the Canoa project. Interestingly, though, and it's an interesting model, and it worked, right? It did what it needed to do. But when it came for this project was sold off by the portfolio asset owner, essentially. And guess what happened? They pushed out the community stake. Yeah. So it was good for as long as we needed the social license, but now it's here already. we don't need it anymore. This is one of those learnings that you have to think about this ex ante when you write up these contracts, right? What happens if the project gets sold on? Yeah. So on the table at the moment, there's 4 wind farms, 1 grid scale battery project under development. They're all planning on community shared investment. And the main model that they use, I thought would be really interesting to you guys in particular, because it does not involve a community entity at all. And there's no asset ownership. So let me just explain how it works, right? And also how this came about a little bit. So they're getting people in the community to invest, but that investment is then pooled and becomes like a community loan facility to the developer. And it's not managed by the co-op or a special purpose vehicle, anything like that. It's managed by a third party, essentially a technology platform. They call themselves a fractional investment platform. They do a lot of other fractional investing, right? And this is just one of the many things that they facilitate investment of, is community shares, essentially, right? Yeah. The reason it came about is because the community in the case of Sapphire just wasn't interested in the risks that are associated with equity ownership, right? And the developer as well, because it puts extra risk exposure on for the developer as well. So because you have individuals directly investing in this fractional investment platform, there's no kind of community body, right? At all. And so, you know, Jara and I had a discussion about this, and she would say, well, that's a missed opportunity for, you know, building local capacity and all the other good stuff that happens when you bring people together and build capacity locally, right? Within the context of a cooperative organization, for example. But we do see that some of that has followed from the project in this case, right? Any questions about this? I see some puzzled faces. Yeah. Yep. Yep.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. First of all, I wonder why, and maybe how this came about is part of the answer, but why would a developer find this sort of offer attractive, the 1.8 loan, the collective loan you sort of described? How's that sort of come about? And when I read sort of local private investment, I think of rich folks. So I wonder what the minimum investment was, and is it sort of, and what's the length of this? I assume it's shorter than sort of a 20-year kind of ownership sort of model that a wind farm
That was
might
3
have.
questions.
So,
So 1,250 is a minimum, but the average was 8,000. The term is 10 years. So I think you're right. I think, and actually I was gonna, so one of the pieces of work we're doing now is to actually investigate whether that's true, right? And whether there's other models that can do the same thing that are more inclusive of marginalized households and communities, because I think you might be right. Yeah. The other question was why it's interesting from the developer's perspective. Yeah, it's absolutely, from a financial standpoint, completely not interesting. But it is interesting from the social license viewpoint. And now it's also interesting because you get extra bonus points in the capacity investment scheme, right? It's built into policy. It's voluntary, but it helps, right? It's like what I said, like a bonus star, like, oh, you did really well kind of thing, like an add-on. And you would like to think that there are developers out there who actually do this because they actually care, right, as well. I'm not sure if that's the case, but in this case, but yeah.
Do you know what interest they charged the developer for their loan versus what's the usual return on investment for a community-owned renewable energy project? Sorry.
Yeah, I can look it up. I don't know it off the top of my head.
I was going to ask the same question, but that's totally fine. But I'm going to follow up on the second to last bullet point. It said community organizing and social capital follows. Can you be a tiny bit more specific about in what? Because I wrote down, you were talking about how we're crying out for community with those backlash and whatnot. How does the investment lead to?
Yeah.
social capital?
Oh, well, there's now a committee and they do like a tour every year. Again, I'm part of this project that we got funded by the Energy Consumers Australia to go and look at the social impacts of this and then look at more equitable models and then compare the social impacts and stuff. So that's about a start. And I suspect it's probably there's less going on. There's certainly less cohesiveness and all of that stuff. But there is some community activity that have been spurred on by this project. I guess that's all I can, yeah. Yeah, this blew my mind when I figured this out and arrived in Australia. Yeah, and the thing is that all of these other projects that are under development are planning to take this same approach. So this has become the blueprint, and one of the reasons that it is, I think, is because it's so easy. The barriers to entry, also from the community side of things, are so low, right? It's highly replicable or scalable, as people like to say, scalable. Yeah. Yeah. How am I for time? Yep, perfect. Okay. So some of you know this. I think Dan knows about this project. I'll just talk a little bit about a project I've been working on for a year in Queensland. And to me, Queensland is sort of like the final frontier, for us to work in, because it's vertically integrated monopoly, state-owned, right? Yeah. So, and one of the reasons this project came about, first of all, is, again, social license. The state's looking for solutions, for tangible solutions for benefit sharing that can improve the social license around these renewable energy zones. So, and specifically for like 1 megawatt plus, basically. So what we did was kind of a research to pilot formula here, where and part of the reason I think I'm telling you about this project is because I guess I'd like to invite us to think about what kind of approaches work, right, as intermediaries to make progress on some of these issues, especially in terrains where you've got pretty hostile sort of policy context. So we started with a research component. We did an international stocktake of all the different models and drivers and the enablers associated with those models. So I'm thinking here, the community shared ownership stuff in the US that's happening, like 8 gigawatts of community shared ownership in the US. Similar models in Sweden and the Netherlands. The shared ownership of transmission out in Canada, that was in there as well. We looked at those. And the wide range of kind of what we're calling community value sharing projects that are now emerging, sort of more typically on the distribution network, right? So not just sort of larger peer-to-peer projects, peer-to-peer trading projects, but also projects where you take a component of the project revenues and you return it to local community in the form of bill credits, right? It's a simple accounting kind of procedure. So they get it as a line item on their utility bill every month. And it's simply because they're putting up with this project, so we're going to give you some money, essentially, right? The alternative that we're seeing is a more sophisticated model where the technology platform matches local generation and local consumption, right? And so and so it comes in as a line item on your bill. It's a bill credit on your utility bill as well, but it reflects this matching process, right? So I'm thinking here about if you've ever come across a NOSI, for example. They use this power tracer technology out in Italy. So that's another form of community value sharing that we looked at. And then we did a whole bunch of interviews to understand what forms of community participation were already happening, what the barriers were. We took our overview of models into focus groups with developers and communities. And we just asked them, what do you think about these models? Like, do they look interesting? Do they look potentially viable? If not, why? What are your concerns? What are the potential opportunities for these models? And then we drafted a guide. We then we put out an expression of interest and worked with 2 projects. So actually one is a city council, the other one is an Aboriginal council, and some developers in that local community with projects that are under early stages of development, to try to come together and work through some of these concepts to arrive at a model, at a sort of like a pre-pilot, nearly like a financial feasibility type of study, where we just walk through what the model might look like, essentially with these stakeholders. We're calling that a pilot. And then integrating the learnings into a guide and a policy framework. So once we did the research, this is the type of information that we took to people, right? We said, this is the full diversity of configurations, things that you can think about, right? You can choose this or this, you can match it up like this, right? Essentially like a list of menu items, right? And then opened up discussions around, the implications of different configurations, right? For participation, for achieving the specific community needs, specific outcomes that developers or councils are after, for example. So we're in the middle of the pilot right now. So I hoped it was finished, but we had a 2-month delay from Queensland government. Go figure, right? For an approval, a single approval. Anyway, so that was the process. And along the way, we learned a lot about what the barriers to community shared ownership in Queensland specifically are. Some of you might have come across, this is some work that I put out this year on essentially a universal type of way to look at what the policy functions you need to meet to really widely embed and enable community shared ownership, right? Irrespective really of where you live, where you are. You need to do all these things. That's the idea. And this is based on just a massive international literature review. So when it comes to Queensland, what do we see, right? If we line it up with this framework, well, lack of simple routes to market, right? There are routes to market, but it's extremely complex to navigate them. And there's a shortage of essentially aggregators and retailers that communities have available, right, to work with them. Grid connection is extremely convoluted process. This is not, I'm sure we're not, it's common around the world, right? But it's particularly convoluted and complex in Queensland. At the moment, there's no special sort of network tariffs to support local energy markets, and a lack of incentives, full stop, for mid-scale projects. I've already mentioned sort of the lack of things like crowdsourcing platforms that can sort of support the, scaling of, and sort of, I guess, take away some of the reinvention of, of the wheel, right? Those early stage things that you need to think about when you want to set up a community project. Barriers to financing the community stake, and a lack of awareness and legitimacy of all models across all key stakeholders, alongside really some ideological and regulatory barriers that are really deeply related to public ownership in regional Queensland in particular. Sorry.
Oh, hi, thanks, Anne. Yeah, I resonate with your talk about a vertically integrated state-owned monopoly. That, of course, being the case almost all of Canada, right? Where the monopoly owns both generation and distribution and are moderately or overtly hostile to small-scale development. Yeah. Because they're carrying such enormous debt loads that to start encouraging distribution of cheap power will crucify them. So I'm wondering how your community project here are getting access to grids. Are they having to build their own grids in some cases? Or are they able to use the state-owned grids? Maybe you can, I'm just, pardon my ignorance, but I'm a little bit confused by that. Thank you.
So the question is around grid connection in particular?
Yes. How do you get access to the state-owned
Mm. Yeah, no, they don't. They don't really want you. That's true. In many cases, it's not even. It's hard to know which utility you need to speak to because it depends exactly on network capacity in that specific area. It depends how close to transmission you are. So there's not even a clear guideline for a certain scale project needs to connect to distribution levels or anything like that. In general, I would completely agree with you in that it seems like they're making it extra difficult, right? And yeah, it's understanding that is like, it's a really long story related to a very large institution with really deep narratives around the fact that I was literally told public ownership is community ownership, right? By Ergon in Queensland. So, and even now, we're trying to work together with them on the solar garden project. And I don't see it happening. So there's one part of Queensland where you have competitive retail, and the rest of the whole of regional Queensland has a state-owned retailer. And I think it's probably completely inaccessible for us because, for these solar garden type projects, you need to work with a retailer, right? In order to get those bill credits to people. If you don't have a retailer, the project falls over. So yeah, I think it's an interesting observation, and it'd be interesting, right? If there's anyone who knows similar situation where there are where maybe you do have a utility that facilitates it better, right? And sort of like clearly demarcates pathways for grid connectivity better, manages the costs better, right? Because that's another huge issue too.
Oh, yeah, just to follow up on that, actually, so yeah, I guess it's understandable that the utilities are not welcoming these kinds of projects, but I was curious about the positions of, let's say, local environmental groups about community energy. So in Quebec, where there's also like a very large state-owned utility, it's actually interesting because some are very open for community projects in many sectors, but not in energy because they're like, oh, it's already public, it's already decommodified, it's already outside the market.
Yeah.
So even within very, we could call progressive environmental groups, civil society groups, there's like these debates happening. So is it the same in Queensland, or?
There's less drive and momentum for community energy, you're saying, because they're okay with the public ownership.
Yeah, because they're like, it's the state, so it's not the market at least.
Yeah, we don't have that as much, partly because this is coal country and not enough is happening, right? So, and people know that. Plus, as I said initially, in many cases, if you're out there, way out there, electricity provision is poor, right? It's unreliable, right? So that's another reason, right? So there's many other reasons you might want to do this, isn't there? Conclusions. Sorry. So, yeah. Oh, good. So I would say we're in sort of emergent to maturing, right? Somewhere in the middle. We've got very thin policy mixes, especially at the mid-scale. And we've got ad hoc support happening in some of these progressive states. So that would be sort of my summary of what's happening. Renewable energy zones are really interesting because I think many of us do see them as pockets of potential opportunity. But at the same time, it's an incredibly crowded policy space. It draws in phenomenally many powerful actors and resources that you have to navigate. And I think often what happens is the community voice, the community interest gets lost amidst all of that. One strategy that I think has been really good for us as an organization, but also kind of as a sector, is to embrace the full diversity in models and approaches, right? That might exist somewhere, or that we can patch together in new ways to meet context, community-specific needs and outcomes. I really am kind of advocating for this research to pilot approach because I think it's phenomenally promising in terms of delivering impact, basically, in the space. And then throughout all of this work, I've seen how hard the work is. You have to be able to speak all these different languages. The business knowledge that I need to do my job well, and the language associated with that. And then it's completely different from how you would talk about things to community, and you need to be able to do all of it, And it's challenging. It's also really rewarding, and it's really important work. So my thoughts in general when it comes to just what we can learn from each other is, I think there might be very similar barriers across different international jurisdictions, and I think that a lot of policy solutions are transferable as well, right? And so there is this huge potential that to learn from each other, an international community of practice, as if we aren't busy enough already. That's right. More travel. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So, if you have questions, or if you want to go into some of these questions as well, I'd love to do some comparative work in my 2 days research a week. And I've been speaking to some of you about that already. So I'd like to open to the floor.
Oh, thanks, Mark. So I'm Jeff Roberts with Bow Valley Green Energy Co-op. What you've described is, I think, is typical of many state jurisdictions. On the other hand, the Alberta model, which has open access into transmission, privately owned transmission, privately owned generation, privately owned distribution, and policies that actually enable behind the meter generation, enable renewable energy generation up to 5 megawatts, which has facilitated community generation and co-ops, has worked. So if you want, I'm just offering, I think if you want to look at something that is working, maybe not working really well, but is working, that's one model that is working. My colleagues at Ottawa Renewable Energy Co-op would love to have the regulatory environment that we have to do our projects. So just a plug out there for free enterprise.
Absolutely.
Hi, this is Ursula Eicker from Concordia University. But we're working on community energy solutions as well in Quebec, where energy prices are very low. So, which basically prevents any kind of financial viability without subsidies, I would say. So I wonder what is the business case in Australia? Does it work? I mean, financially, is there a good payback? I mean, you showed all the benefits. It looked quite good, but what would you do in a situation where that's not even the case? Because
So are you saying retail prices are low, or just all prices? All prices are low.
all electricity prices are
see.
like at 7 cents per kilowatt hour, Canadian cents.
Wow.
So yeah,
that's pretty
residential prices. So it's just so low. You just can't make a solar project work.
Yeah. I've never heard of prices that low anywhere. And all right. Well, so that is interesting, isn't it? Yeah. So this is something we see everywhere, right? Places like Norway, like New Zealand, right, with large scale hydro, they tend to not let in decentralized energy. Yeah, it's just I don't have any easy solutions at all. I mean, it's something you're going to have to compete with, right? And I imagine it also just reduces the animo and the impetus for projects in the first place as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the same thing with the state-owned utility, which is quite well perceived. But I think it's changing now because they need to build, they want to double their capacity, and that won't be done by dams alone. So I think there's now a great opportunity for solar and wind, and but so far it's just big private investors bidding for projects because the state utility doesn't want to build it all themselves. But it might, I think, if we could generate some momentum from the community energy side, it might be good timing to do it now.
Just one thought I have is, you know, I think we need to start looking at energy as basically a social policy, right? Because if you look at some of these impacts, and and there's some really good documentation around this now, they are so diverse, right? And if you include the impacts that stem from how communities then spend the revenues that are getting from these projects as well, you start seeing that they're essentially, you know, they're taking on what should be government roles, right, for a range of social and environmental and economic issues that are pertinent in these areas. So if you have a social case for projects, so what I mean is, if there's also a social priority, right, and you can show maybe that these projects can deliver all of these benefits, and that there's actually a case to be made for them. It's a long shot. That's what I would say.
This is a small question. I mean, how did you identify these pilot communities in your search tool?
It was very hard. It was very hard. You know why? Because in the middle of our project, we had a change of government and it went conservative. And the entire sector was in limbo. And then it was very clear that they were not going to take on the massive sort of policy program under which our project was funded as well, right? And see it through to implementation. So everyone was waiting to see what the new government would do, as always happens, right? We ended up, essentially, it ended up being influenced by regulatory changes around local councils in Queensland from a couple of weeks ago are now obliged to negotiate community benefits agreements with all developers above a certain scale. And so local councils came to us and said, we need your help. We don't know how to do this. So it's really about, in short, if I had to summarize it, is we had to be really adaptive and look at just utilize the existing policy dynamics, right, and sort of play into it. But yeah, I also don't know, because we're about to start these pilots, whether, you know, like whether they're going to actually result in any actual projects, right, at the end of the day. So I'll keep you posted as well.
Thank you so much, Anna. That's really wonderful. Gives us a lot of food for thought.